We're going to go ahead and start. So today's webinar is email replies to approved transactions, and it's given by our own Emily Stein. And Emily, you can go ahead and start your webinar, and people can feel free to ask questions in between if there's something that comes up. You know, we're good with questions during the presentation, but we will also open it up at the end for any questions. This webinar is recorded and we will post on our PittNUG website. So go ahead, Emily. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Rhonda, and thank you everybody for joining our webinar today. So I just want to take a minute to introduce myself. I am Emily Stein. I'm a consultant here with Grossman, Yannick & Ford's ERP team. I graduated from Grove City College with degrees in accounting and business management, and I'm currently working towards getting my CPA while I work with GYF. So that's just a little bit about myself. So today I kind of want to just a brief overview of what we're going to do. I want to picture kind of a map of trying to show you, and then I will start digging into some of the system requirements that you're going to need to go through in your NetSuite to kind of set this up. And then I'm going to talk about some more of the details of how this workflow and process is actually configured. And then I'm going to walk you through a demonstration of how this actually works so you can see it. And then just discuss some of the opportunities and limitations that exist with this feature. And then, as Rhonda mentioned, there will be time at the end for questions, but do feel free to chime in if you have any as we're going. So just a broad overview, this feature is going to enable supervisors in your organization to approve transactions without accessing NetSuite and without the need for a NetSuite user license. So kind of a big process overview of how this would work. An example, I'm going to use myself entering a purchase order. So I'm the employee and I can my supervisor will receive an email letting know that I've entered the transaction and it needs to be approved. My supervisor can then reply to that email and signify whether my request was approved or rejected. You don't need to log into NetSuite at all. And then a saved search in will go out and it will find which transactions were approved and trigger a workflow, and then that will successfully approve the transaction. So that's just kind of the big picture of how this is going to work. And now we can move on to kind of some of the requirements that you're going to need to do this. So the first thing is that you are going to need a functioning approval workflow for transactions in your NetSuite instance. This could be kind of a standard NetSuite one, or it could be a custom one that you may already have set up, but you are going to need an approval workflow. I'm using NetSuite supervisor fields. I'm going to need to have employee records with the correct supervisor designated on it. So my employee record in NetSuite has Angie McCoy as my supervisor designated on there. You're also going to need to configure an email template with the necessary information for your approver. And this is something that your organization is going to need to kind of determine what needs you have. But for example, I sent an email to Angie saying, hey, it's not going to do her a lot of good because she doesn't have access to NetSuite. So you need to determine what all information is going to need to be included in the email that goes to the transaction approver. And then you are also going to need to set up a save search to look for those incoming approval emails. And I'll get into the detail of the save search a little later. But that's kind of so then how this all is functioning is essentially two workflows. As you can see, I have workflow 1 here, which is just a very simple standard NetSuite native approval workflow. And the only change that we made to this is that in there, we added an action to send an email to an approver upon the creation of a transaction. And then separately from that, we kind of have our other workflow that's actually doing the work of approving transactions. So once the email is sent out by the first workflow and the approver replies to it, this second workflow is what triggers to go and actually approve the transaction. So you could combine these into one workflow if you wanted to. Again, if you already have kind of an approval workflow set up with your system, it might be easier to try to add what I've labeled workflow 2 into it. But if you're starting from scratch, I chose to do it separately because it's easier to kind of troubleshoot as you're going along, and it's easier to make changes when it's separated out. So getting into some of the really fine details of this, in our first workflow, this is a native approval workflow. You can see that I've added an action to just set the next approver as the employee's supervisor. So in my example, this is going to set the next approver on my purchase order transaction as Angie McCoy. That's going to be necessary for the email to go to the right place and for the whole workflow to kick off from there. So I just wanted to highlight that. And then this next state, so now we're in the pending approval state. So I've entered a purchase order or other transaction, and now it's going to send the email out to Angie that's saying, hey, this needs to be approved. So that's what you're going to do. The action is going to be a send email action, and it's going to the next approver that we set in the previous state on that transaction. And then in kind of my workflow number 2, this is a lot simpler. This is what's going out and approving the transactions, and this is all running based off a save search. So I labeled mine very creatively POs for approval, but this is what's running the workflow. It's looking at that save search and saying, okay, these transactions are approved. And then there's just one thing in this workflow. All it does is saying that the supervisor approval is true. So it's very simple. Once it gets caught up in that save search, it just says, okay, great, check off that the supervisor has approved this. So that save search that I was talking about that really triggers that second workflow, this is kind of the basic setup of it. You can see here that I've said, okay, we're approving purchase orders. That's the type. And then the status is purchase orders that are pending supervisor approval. Obviously, we don't want it to catch purchase orders that have been rejected or in a different state. And then I've said mainline is true. And then the messages joined fields are really where we catch the emails that are coming back into NetSuite. So we just want to say that they are incoming messages rather than outgoing messages. And then we also want to say that the subject line contains the word approve. So in my example, I've said the criteria to approve it is that the subject of the email reply is as approved, so that the person who's approving the transaction can just wipe out the subject line and write either approve or reject. I'll talk a little bit more later about why I've done it that way, but I think that the best method for doing this is to capture your approval or rejection in the subject line. So now I kind of want to walk you guys through a demonstration. Now that you have a little bit of background of kind of some of the setup that we did to get this to work, it's best and easiest to understand with a demonstration. So as you can see, to start off my employee rec, the key here is that I've given myself a supervisor, Angie McCoy, and she's going to be the one who receives the emails to approve my transactions. So that's the first step, first requirement, great. The next step is that I'm going to come to my employee center role and I'm going to say, okay, great, enter a purchase request. You can see I've entered a few already. I'm going to enter a new one. So that's where I would click enter my purchase request. Then I'm going to see the screen where I'm filling out my purchase request. This is just pretty standard. You can see I've said that I need therapy supplies for our May workshop. I put the item, description, quantity, rate, and amount on there. Pretty simple, nothing too wild here. If you did have a more developed purchase request screen, obviously you could use that here. And then you can see up in the top left, it says save and submit for approval. So this native NetSuite workflow that I use does give you the option to save purchase requests before you submit them for approval. So you can see in this next screen, I actually did save it. I didn't hit save and submit for approval. I just hit save and then went back later and hit submit for approval. So that is an option if you're looking to develop your approval workflow from kind of the ground up to do this. You can make it so that people have the opportunity to edit their transactions or purchase requests before they're submitted for approval. So I just wanted to point that out. So in my scenario, I've saved my purchase request and I go ahead and hit submit for approval. At that point, it triggers the email in that first workflow that I was talking about. So this is the email template that we have set up. And you'll notice that it's pretty simple what it says in the body of the message. You have a purchase order to approve. Please review the attached PDF and reply approve or reject in the subject line. And then it says you can just enter any notes if you'd like to. So you'll notice that there's not a lot of information in the body of this, which is something that I mentioned before. But how we actually set this up is to attach the PDF of the transaction, which is an option you can do. So I chose this route because it's very simple. It attaches the transaction, and all they need to do is open this little PDF in the email that they get, and they can see all the information that they need for the purchase order or purchase request. So that is an option I wanted to point out. If you don't want to customize this email template a lot, you can always just attach the transaction. But if you have people who are going to be approving on their phone and they don't want to have to open up a separate PDF, you could always customize the body of this email here and write something different than what I've written, and that would work for them. So in this scenario, Angie McCoy has received this email. She says, great, I have a purchase order to approve. I'm going to open the PDF. Everything looks great. So I'm going to go ahead and approve it. So this would be the email that she would send back. And obviously it looks like I'm sending the email just for purposes of this demonstration, but this would be the person who's approving the transaction, like Angie. So she just says, great, looks great. And then you can notice that I've wiped out the subject line of the email and I've just put approve. The reason I did this, and the reason that I'm kind of running everything off the subject line of the email is because you'll notice when she replies back, it carries down my original email. And it does say in my original email, you have a purchase order to approve. So if you were running this workflow off just the body of the email that's sending back, you could accidentally approve purchase orders or transactions based on the information that was previously in the body of the email. So it would, even if I said, instead of looks great, I said reject, looks terrible, it would still see the word approve of this. I was running off the body of the email and it would go ahead and approve that transaction. So that's why I went with the route of using the subject line and just saying approve or reject in the subject. And my save search is only looking at the subject line of the email. So you don't accidentally approve or reject transactions. You could do it in the body of the email. You would just have to be careful about what you say in your original message so that you don't accidentally approve. So I did want to note that. So then at this point, you can see if we were to reopen the purchase order in NetSuite, there is this incoming message that was received back that has the subject line of approve. So that's attached to the transaction. And again, this is all me doing it in NetSuite. In my scenario, Angie doesn't have access to NetSuite. She is exclusively sending that email. But I just wanted to show that it does attach this email back to the transaction in NetSuite. This is my save search that I was talking about, and you can see that it's picked up my purchase order on here. So it looked at this messages that was attached to the purchase order, and it pulled this transaction onto my save search. And at that point, my next workflow ran, and it approved this transaction based on the results of that save search. You can see it's checked the supervisor approval box, and it now says approved by supervisor pending receipt. And here you can see that that was done all by the system scheduled workflow. I did not manually go in and do anything. So this is a very easy solution to have the system approve and change the status of these transactions for you. And then you can see the last step, if I were to come back into my Employee Center role, that purchase order is now pending receipt, which shows that it's been approved. So some of the big opportunities with this, obviously there are a lot of time and cost savings to your organization if you were to use this. The main one being that your supervisors do not need a user license to do this. If you have somebody who's only approving transactions and doesn't want to get into NetSuite, they don't need to anymore using this functionality. And they can also approve transactions a lot quicker. It's much easier to type back in an email subject line approve than it is to log into NetSuite and look at a transaction. It's a lot easier to do. Again, we've all been using email for so long. If you have somebody who's kind of newer to NetSuite, this might be a great option that they can just say approve in an email. And there is to add reject functionality, kind of depending on if you have an approval workflow already set up with rejection levels, you could add that in so that somebody could say reject and it would send the transaction to a different workflow state. But there are some limitations to this. The main one being that additional levels of approval are going to add complication. If you have a very complicated approval process with 3 or 4 levels of approvers, it's going to be complicated to figure out the exact step that you need to send the transaction to the correct state that it needs to go based off emails. And as I mentioned before, you do need exact replies in these emails. That's why I did it off the subject line, but you just need to be careful because NetSuite's just looking for words, so it doesn't know if you're accidentally approving something. And a limitation of the standard scheduled workflow that I have running is that it only goes every 30 minutes. So that's kind of my broad overview and demonstration of that, but if anybody has any questions, I would love to hear them.
Hi, this is Steve Baylog.
Hi.
Is possible native NetSuite approval bundle?
I believe I use the approval bundle to do this, but I think you can make a workflow.
Yeah, you can do your own. You can just, as long as you check off on the settings that there is approval, you don't need to use the approval bundle, but you can do just straight approval workflow yourself.
I wasn't sure about the next approver. Like we have something custom set up with vendor bills, but I thought on the standard transactions, I didn't. Is there a next approver field, or does that only come?
You can add a custom field of next approver and do it the same way with just any workflow. That's really what that's setting up the bundle, and the bundle's free. The approval bundles in the system should be free anyway on the customization.
All right. The other question is, even though the user doesn't need a license, do they still need to be set up as a user in NetSuite just with no access?
Yeah, it's an employee. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
It looks like Michelle Harda did a group chat with a question that says, could you embed approve or reject buttons into the body of the email?
I believe you could, yes.
But that's going to take scripting to do that, and it is a call out to NetSuite, right? Or we would do scripting to do a send within Outlook or whatever the email is, that button. This was the quickest, easiest way to avoid having everybody have a license. And I don't know if you guys use now the approval with the email link. If you're not logged in, you click the link, you have to log in and so on, or go to the mobile app to see it. This was just a quicker way to do it.
Thank you. I got a little bit of construction going on here, so.
That's okay. We've heard all kinds of things, so.
Yeah, great job though. Very thorough explanation of this. Thank you.
Anyone else? Questions? I mean, you can always reach out if you think of something later that you are, wanting to know about, or any other questions later. Just reach out to me and we can get Emily in touch.
Hi, this is Steve. Just one more, I guess, while we have time.
Yeah.
If we do. On the limitation aspect, you were saying about, if there's multiple levels of approval, which we would have based on dollar thresholds. We have supervisors, managers, directors, etc. Is there a way to progress the next approver, or is it all really kind of limited to the one level based upon the original user?
No, the concept's the same, because when that email comes back as approved, it updates the NetSuite record as that level is approved. Then the original workflow goes to the next approver.
Oh, okay.
You know what I mean? That's why Emily did them as 2 separate workflows. But the original workflow, whatever your original approval workflow exists, that's there. That's still going to be there. This can be like a separate thing that the workflow running off that saved search, they'll then send back and should pick up in the next level of the workflow, the original.
Okay. All right.
We just didn't build it out that way. We didn't test it through that way.
All right, just wanted to be sure. Thanks.
Anyone else? Okay. Again, this meeting's recorded, so you can always go back for refreshers or, you know, just to follow up on anything you weren't sure about. Reach out to us. If anyone has an idea for the next PittNUG meeting, even if it's a third party that you want to see or whatever, we're looking for ideas. We're looking for things to do. So please feel free to reach out and email me, and we'll work on the next meeting. So that's it. Emily, thank you. You did a great job. I appreciate you doing this for our group, and everyone have a great afternoon.